Welcome back to From Wreck to Remarkable. Today we're getting into the nitty-gritty of building regulations. Now, I know this might sound like the least exciting topic in the world, but trust me, understanding building regulations is absolutely crucial. This is about safety, quality, and making sure your refurbishment is done properly. Get this wrong, and you could face serious problems down the line. Let me start with a story that shows exactly why building regulations matter. A few years ago, I was asked to look at a property in Liverpool that had been renovated by the previous owner. The current owner, a woman called Claire, was trying to sell, but the buyer surveyor had raised concerns about the loft conversion. Claire had bought the property 2 years earlier and the loft conversion had already been done. It looked great, nice bedroom, ensuite bathroom, Velux windows, the works. But when we dug into it, we discovered the previous owner had done the conversion without building regulations approval. The buyer's solicitor wanted to see the completion certificate, and there wasn't one. So Claire had to get a structural engineer to inspect the loft retrospectively. The engineer found multiple issues. The floor joists weren't adequate for the new use, which meant the floor could potentially collapse. The staircase didn't meet fire safety requirements, which meant in a fire people might not be able to escape safely. There was no proper insulation, which meant the space was freezing in winter and boiling in summer, and the bathroom drainage wasn't done properly, which was causing damp in the ceiling below. Claire had to spend £18,000 putting all of this right before she could sell, and this was work that had already been done once. If the previous owner had just followed building regulations in the first place, none of this would have happened. That's why building regulations matter. They're not just bureaucracy, they're about making sure buildings are safe, healthy, and energy efficient. So let's break down what building regulations actually are and how they work. Building regulations are a set of standards for the design and construction of buildings. They're set out in a series of documents called approved documents, each covering a different aspect of building work. The regulations apply to most building work in England and Wales. Scotland and Northern Ireland have their own systems, which are similar but not identical. The building regulations are divided into parts, labeled A through P, and each part covers a specific topic. Let's go through the key ones you need to know about. Part A is about structure. This covers the structural stability of buildings. It ensures that buildings can support their own weight, the weight of people and furniture, and external forces like wind and snow. If you're building an extension, knocking down walls, or doing a loft conversion, Part A is relevant. You'll typically need structural calculation from an engineer to show that your design is safe. Part B is about fire safety. This is crucial, especially for loft conversion and extensions. Part B covers things like fire resistance of walls and floors, means of escape in case of fire, fire detection and alarm systems, and access for the fire service. For example, if you're converting a loft, you need to make sure there's a safe escape route, which usually means a proper staircase with fire-resistant construction and smoke alarms on every floor. Part C is about site preparation and resistance to contaminants and moisture. This covers things like damp proofing, drainage, and dealing with contaminated land. If you're building an extension, you need to make sure the foundations are on stable ground and that you have proper damp-proof courses to prevent moisture rising into the walls. Part D is about toxic substances. This is less commonly relevant for domestic refurbishments, but it covers things like insulation, materials that might release harmful substances. Part E is about resistance to the passage of sound. This is important if you're converting a house into flats, or if you're doing work that affects party walls. You need to ensure adequate sound insulation between dwellings. Part F is about ventilation. This ensures that buildings have adequate ventilation to prevent condensation, remove pollutants, and provide fresh air. If you're adding a new room, you need to make sure it has adequate ventilation, either through windows or mechanical ventilation. Part G is about sanitation, hot water safety, and water efficiency. This covers things like toilets, bathrooms, drainage, and water supply. If you're adding a bathroom or kitchen, Part G is relevant. Part H is about drainage and waste disposal. This covers foul water drainage, rainwater drainage, and solid waste storage. If your extension or refurbishment affects drainage, you need to comply with Part H. Part J is about combustion appliances and fuel storage systems. This covers things like boilers, wood burners, and flues. If you're installing or altering a heating system, Part J applies. Part K is about protection from falling, collision, and impact. This covers things like stairs, ramps, balustrades, and guarding. If you're installing a new staircase or balcony, Part K sets out the requirements for dimension and safety. Part L is about conservation of fuel and power. This is all about energy efficiency. Part L requires that buildings are properly insulated, that heating systems are efficient, and that energy use is minimized. This is a big one for refurbishments because it often means upgrading insulation, installing energy efficient windows, and using efficient heating systems. Part L has become increasingly stringent over the years as the government pushes for more energy efficient buildings. Part M is about access to and use of buildings. This covers accessibility for people with disabilities. For domestic properties, Part M sets out requirements for things like level access, door widths, and accessible bathrooms. There are different levels of compliance depending on the type of building and the work being done. Part N is about glazing safety. This ensures that windows and glass doors are safe and won't cause injury if broken. It covers things like using toughened or laminated glass in certain locations. Part P is about electrical safety. This covers the design, installation, inspection, and testing of electrical installations. If you're doing any electrical work beyond very minor repairs, Part P applies. You either need to use a registered electrician who can self-certify the work, or you need to notify building control before you start. Part Q is about security in new dwellings. This sets minimum standards for doors and windows to resist physical attack by burglars. It's mainly relevant for new build homes, but it can apply to some refurbishments. And Part S is about infrastructure for charging electric vehicles. This is a recent addition and requires that new buildings and some refurbishments include infrastructure for electric vehicle charging points. Now, you don't need to become an expert in all of these parts, but you do need to know which ones apply to your project and make sure your design and construction comply. So how do you actually get building regulations approval? There are two main routes: full plans and building notice. With full plans, you submit detailed drawings and specifications to building control before you start work. Building control reviews your plans, checks them against the building regulations, and either approves them or asks for amendments. Once approved, you can start work. The advantage of the full plans is that you have certainty before you start. You know your design complies. The disadvantage is that it takes longer, usually a few weeks, and costs a bit more. With a building notice, you simply notify building control that you're going to start work. You don't submit detailed plans up front. Instead, building control inspects the work as it progresses and ensures it complies with the regulations. The advantage is that it's quicker and simpler to get started. The disadvantage is that you don't have upfront approval. So if building control finds something that doesn't comply during construction, you might have to change it or redo it. For most refurbishment projects, I recommend using full plans. Yes, it takes a bit longer upfront, but it gives you certainty and reduces the risk of problems during construction. You also have a choice between using your local authority building control or an approved inspector. Approved inspectors are private companies that provide the same service as local authority building control. The standards are the same, but some people prefer approved inspectors because they can be more flexible and responsive. The cost is usually similar. Once you've submitted your application or notice, building control will want to inspect the work at certain stages. The key inspection stages are usually excavation of foundations. Before you pour the foundation concrete, after you've poured the foundations, but before you build on them, damp-proof course to check the damp proofing is in place. Drains,
before you cover them up. Completion at the end of the project to check everything is finished properly.
There might be additional inspections depending on the work. For example, structural steelwork, insulation, fire safety measures, or electrical work.
It's crucial that you notify building control at each stage and don't cover up work before it's been inspected. If you do, they can require you to open it up again so they can inspect it, which is expensive and time consuming.
At the end of the project, once building control is satisfied that everything complies with the regulations, they'll issue a completion certificate. This is a really important document. It proves that the work was done to the required standards, and you'll need it when you come to sell the property.
Let me give you an example of a project where building regulations were handled really well.
I worked with a couple, Emma and John, in Bristol. They were doing a major refurbishment including a rear extension, a loft conversion, and a full rewire. Before they started, they submitted full plans to building control. The plans included structural calculations for the extension and loft, details of the insulation and ventilation, drainage plans, and specifications for the electrical work. Building control reviewed the plans and came back with a few comments. They wanted more detail on the fire safety measures for the loft conversion, and they asked for clarification on the drainage. Emma and John's architect addressed these points and resubmitted. The plans were approved. During construction, building control came to inspect at each key stage: foundations, drains, structure, insulation, fire safety, electrics. Each time, they signed off that the work was compliant. At the end of the project, Emma and John received their completion certificate. When they sold the property 3 years later, the buyer's solicitor asked for the completion certificate. Emma and John provided it, and there were no issues. The sale went through smoothly. That's how it should work. Proper approval upfront, inspections at each stage, and the completion certificate at the end.
Now let me give you an example of where it went wrong. A guy called Steve in Manchester decided to convert his garage into a home office. He thought it was a simple job, so he didn't bother with building regulations. He hired a builder who insulated the walls, plastered them, put in some electrics, and laid the floor. It looked great. 2 years later, Steve decided to sell. The buyer's solicitor asked if any building work had been done and whether there were completion certificates. Steve admitted he'd converted the garage but didn't have a certificate. The buyer insisted on a retrospective building regulations inspection. Steve had to apply for a regularization certificate, which involved a building control officer inspecting the work. They found multiple issues. The insulation wasn't adequate, the electrics weren't done to standard, and there was no proper ventilation, which had caused condensation and mold.
Steve had to pay for remedial work, which cost him £6,000. The sale was delayed by 2 months, and the buyer negotiated a price reduction because of the hassle. All of this could have been avoided if Steve had just applied for building regulations approval in the first place.
So what are my top tips for dealing with building regulations?
1. Always check whether your work requires building regulations approval. If in doubt, ask. You can call your local authority, building control, or an approved inspector and describe your project. They'll tell you if you need approval.
2. Decide whether to use full plans or a building notice. For most projects, full plans is the safer option.
3. Choose between local authority building control and an approved inspector. Both are fine, so it's a matter of personal preference and who you feel more comfortable working with. 4. If you're using professionals like architects, structural engineers, or electricians, make sure they understand the building regulations requirements and design accordingly. 5. Notify building control at each inspection stage and don't cover up work before it's been inspected.
6. Keep all your paperwork. Keep the approval notice, inspection records, and most importantly, the completion certificate.
And 7. If you're buying a property where work has been done, always ask for building regulation completion certificates. If they're not available, factor in the cost and hassle of getting retrospective approval. 22. In the full course, there's a building regulations part summary which is a one-page document that lists all the parts and what they cover. My students print this out and keep it handy because it's a quick reference guide. It helps you understand which parts are relevant to your project and what you need to think about.
Let me share one more story that shows the importance of getting this right.
I had a student, Aisha, who was refurbishing a Victorian terrace in London. She was doing a full renovation, including a new kitchen, new bathrooms, rewiring, and a new boiler. She submitted full plans to building control at the start of the project. During the project, building control came to inspect the electrics. They found that the electrician had used the wrong type of cable in one area. It wasn't dangerous, but it didn't comply with Part P. The electrician had to redo that section, which cost a bit of time and money, but it was caught early and fixed.
At the end of the project, building control did a final inspection. Everything was compliant, and Aisha received her completion certificate. When she sold the property a year later, the buyer was reassured by the fact that all the work had been done properly and signed off by building control. The sale went through without any issues. That's the value of building regulations. Yes, it's an extra process, but it ensures quality and safety, and it protects your investment. So to recap, building regulations are a set of standards covering structure, fire safety, ventilation, energy efficiency, drainage, electrical safety, and more. You need building regulations approval for most building work. You can choose between full plans and a building notice, and between local authority building control and an approved inspector. Building control will inspect your work at key stages, and at the end, you'll receive a completion certificate. Always keep this certificate because you'll need it when you sell.
In the next episode, we're going to tackle the Party Wall Act. This is essential knowledge if you're doing any work that affects a shared wall with a neighbor. We'll cover when the Act applies, what notices you need to serve, and how to avoid disputes. Your action step for this episode is to think about your project and identify which parts of the building regulations are relevant. If you're doing an extension, you'll need to think about structure, insulation, drainage, and possibly fire safety. If you're doing a loft conversion, fire safety and structure are key. Make a list of the relevant parts and start to familiarize yourself with the requirements. The more you understand upfront, the smoother your project will be. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next episode where we demystify the Party Wall Act.